All right, let's address the elephant in the room. Penn State missed out on Jamonte Waller. Penn State missed out on Amaris Williams, two important defensive prospects to the Florida Gators. But Penn State fans, don't fret because the Nittany Lions are very close to landing not one, not two, but three top-tier wide receiver recruits in the class of 2024.
You are Locked On Nittany Lions, your daily podcast on the Penn State Nittany Lions, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, thanks so much for making Locked On Nittany Lions your first listen and watch every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Zach Sako, your host of the show, and I'm joined once again by the man himself when it comes to recruiting, especially on the East Coast. He is the person to check up on with all the latest, and that is Adam Friedman of Rivals, national recruiting analyst, plus rankings director, primarily knows the prospects on the East Coast, but you can get his analysis on just about anywhere. Adam, thanks so much for joining the podcast again. I really appreciate it, especially with all the news that has unfolded in such a quick time frame.
Yeah, it's a busy time. I appreciate you having me, Zach. There's plenty to talk about right now. I actually did a little research on this from last year. We're in commitment season right now. 40 players who ended up in the 2023 Rivals 250 ended up committing in the first two weeks, the 3 weeks ending June to the beginning of July. So we're right in it right now. Others are making their decisions. It's obviously official visit season, so plenty to talk about right now.
And where can people keep up with what you do personally?
I'm on Twitter, Rivals Friedman on Twitter, on Instagram, Rivals Friedman. I'm always all over the website too, rivals.com. You can find my stuff there. We just did a big rankings update for the 2024 class. We've got a 2025 rankings update coming out next week, a week from today. So, you get a sneak peek of that coming up here over the next few days. And there's, again, plenty of news to read about around the network right now.
And Locked On Nittany Lions is your go-to podcast for Penn State rivals. You can check out happyvalleyinsider.com. We're talking Penn State recruiting on this show, but if you want to see more in-depth coverage, go check out that website, happyvalleyinsider.com. Okay, Adam, there a list of prospects. That's normally what we do here. This is, I think, our third episode together that we've done that you've been able to take some time out of your busy schedule to chat here specifically about Penn State. There's been a lot of developments recently. It sounds like Marcus Haggins is really getting his footing. Deion Barnes, not too far behind, but I would say that in terms of new positional coaches for Penn State, that Marcus Haggins is starting to make that impact that everyone's been craving for the Nittany Lions. So we're going to talk about wide receivers first, get into just the situation with Penn State missing out on some important defensive prospects, particularly to Florida, but just what that means in general for some other guys they have been targeting, and then just kind of looking generally at the landscape, what Penn State might be able to do as those precedents change or as those priorities change, where they're going to be targeting in the meantime. So, and there's still official visits yet to be had. So let's start with wide receiver as promised here. Tyseer Denmark decommits from Oregon, Roman Catholic High School, so that's over in the Philadelphia area, and he took the surprise official visit. It wasn't one that was planned out well in advance, that this was listed and everybody knew about it for a month. This was something that kind of happened almost last second. Denmark decommits from the Oregon Ducks, so a little bit of payback here, this Penn State-Oregon recruiting battle that's going on. But what is the latest with Penn State landing possibly one of the best receivers in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, really like Tyseer Denmark as a prospect. Saw him in person last year. Saw him a few times the last offseason. A really talented kid, great with the ball in his hands, a really good downfield receiver. He's tough to bring down in the open field. We haven't seen a lot of him this offseason, and we're hoping that that doesn't mean he's taken a step back in his development. But in terms of his recruitment, he's been all Oregon Ducks up until very recently. Oregon has obviously done well recruiting receivers this class, and maybe they weren't super unhappy to see Tyseer Denmark leave because they have some really good players in this class already. But Tyseer Denmark decommitting after his official visit to Penn State, broke the news here on Rivals.com that he decommitted after speaking with his head coach at Roman Catholic, Rick Preet. Shout out to Rick. We're looking forward to seeing what Tyseer can do on the field this year, but I expect him to end up as part of this Penn State class probably sooner rather than later. We will see him announce something, I would imagine, in the next few weeks here, if not sooner than that. And he won't be the only receiver to jump
Yeah.
on board with Penn State. He's one of their top priorities of the position, but it's a position of need, and they still don't have any commitments yet at the
No.
position. But there are a few players who are leaning towards Penn State right now at receiver. Looking at Nick Marsh, who's announcing soon, Josiah Brown, who's up on his official visit this past weekend. Those are some guys we've got our eye on for Penn State right now. I expect them to end up as Nittany Lions sooner rather than later, like I said, for Tyseer. But those would be three that I'm keeping a close eye on at this point.
There's the potential. I have 3 listed on the chart here, but is there the possibility that Penn State takes 4 in this class? Because someone that I was going to ask about was Peter Gonzalez, because you beat me to the punch. Josiah Brown, Nick Marsh, those are guys. And I like the diverse set of talent, right? Marsh is kind of that bigger target. Denmark and Brown are more of those smaller, quick, athletic kind of guys. And Peter Gonzalez also has a bigger build as well. So Penn State, for this past class, they only had 1 wide receiver commit in Carmelo Taylor. Now that seems like it's going to be flipped on its head to possibly 4 commits. So do the Nittany Lions want to take 3 or more, or are they pretty much content with 2 to 3 players at the wide receiver spot?
At least 3. At least
Okay.
3 is the way I've heard it. They'd like to have 4. Peter Gonzalez, I don't mean to forget him. He's coming off a knee injury from last year, 18 months out from a knee injury right now. So, but he did post a great time at their camp this year. He had a really good workout for them. The coaches really liked what they saw out of him. So I do expect him to end up a Nittany Lion as well. And unless something changes, they'll take all 4. But at least 3 is what they were aiming for in this class.
Is this a matter of Marcus Haggins really getting settled in as the wide receivers coach at Penn State? Because at first it seemed like everything was slow to materialize. What happened so quickly that Penn State is able to get someone like Denmark, who was all in on Oregon, just all of a sudden potentially flip, and then Brown and Gonzalez and Marsh? All it seems to be all at the same time like this.
Yeah, it does kind of seem like that. And I think the camp season helped them figure out who they really wanted to, really prioritize. Marsh was, I think, their top priority at the position. And Denmark is someone who sort of came back to them. Originally when he committed to Oregon, he was deciding between Ohio State and the Ducks. It wasn't necessarily Penn State or Oregon. But the Nittany Lions really kept at it. They stayed in contact. They've made sure that the relationship stays strong and build even stronger relationships. Haggins wasn't he wasn't at Penn State early on there in Denmark's recruitment. He was at Virginia. So now that he was at Penn State, be able to build that relationship from scratch, lean on some of those southeastern Pennsylvania ties that the staff has. I think it made Denmark a little bit more comfortable, and I think we're seeing the fruits of his labor at this point.
I like it. The best in Pennsylvania stay in Pennsylvania. It is Locked On Nittany Lions. Now, there are some players that are out of Pennsylvania that have at least spurned Penn State for the moment. They have chosen other places, at least in the recent days, in a matter of 24 to 48 hours here. We're going to talk about them in just a moment. But first, let's hear from our sponsor of today's episode, and that is FanDuel Sportsbook, America's #1 sportsbook. Grand slams, no hitters, double plays, they are all here on FanDuel, and there's no better place to get in on all the Major League Baseball action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no sweat first bet up to $1,000. That is right, $1,000 in bonus bets back if your first bet does not win. It's safe, secure, super easy to use. My favorite tool about FanDuel is the fact that you can cash out your winnings. That is my favorite feature. You can cash out your winnings anytime, and it is quick. Then you can bet on everything Major League Baseball. You think Aaron Judge will hit a home run? Do you think Max Scherzer is going to go over on his strikeouts? You got a sneaky money line underdog play. You can play all of them and more. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine those bets and others for a chance at a bigger payout with the same game parlay. So don't miss your chance on a no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets back. All you got to do is visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. That is FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. And once again, thanks so much for making Locked On Nittany Lions your first listen and watch every single day. You got to go check out Locked On's NBA mock draft special. It's here. It's bigger than ever. Follow along the entire first round in a 6 episode ultimate mock draft experience only Locked On can deliver. All episodes are available now on Locked On NBA Big Board on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast. Back into Penn State recruiting. Penn State, yes, wide receiver all of a sudden becomes a position of premium, but Penn State is missing out on key defenders, particularly to the Florida Gators, who are not surprisingly jumping up the rankings, but just I didn't expect Florida to land, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I've lost count, 6 recruits. I thought Penn State getting 3 verbal commitments in one day. I know 1 decommitted. Besides the point, they were able to get 3 in one day. I think Florida landed 6 in a matter of 48 hours, 2 of which were very important Penn State targets, Amaris Williams and Jamonte Waller. I was on the fan base of Jamonte Waller to Penn State. It seemed like everything was good after his official visit. He goes down to the swamp. And in this matter of time, right, Adam, you and I are recording this podcast. He is verbally committed to Florida. This is very recent news. So what ultimately transpired here? How did Penn State go from being a very heavy favorite for both of these players to them committing to Georgia right out of the gate after their official visits?
Yeah, committing to Florida right after their visits. It was really interesting to see how Florida really stacked commitment on commitment on commitment on commitment on commitment over the weekend. It was really something to watch. So Billy Napier really has it rolling right now after a big weekend. They lost their quarterback commit for the 25 class, who ends up flipping to Ole Miss and reclassing all the way up to 2023, and they counter with an onslaught of commitments this weekend after their official visits. Really were super successful. The biggest surprise of the weekend for Florida, if we're, I don't want to get us too off track here, but Aaron Childs, the top 100 Rivals 100 linebacker out of Olney, Maryland, Good Counsel High School, committing to Florida out of the blue. He was a heavy lean to Michigan, was, I think, the surprise of the 2024 class at this point. It was really something to see. But Amaris Williams committing to Florida, a blow for Penn State. They had him up on the official visit, and he even called Penn State the leader after his visit to Happy Valley. Penn State was feeling really good about that. Jamonte Waller, same sort of thing. They were the heavy favorite for him, and both of them end up at Florida now. And I don't necessarily think it's anything that Penn State did or didn't do. More about Florida really doing what they needed to do to get their recruiting class on track, to really make sure that they solidified their front seven. That's what they prioritized in this recruiting class. That's an area they really needed to fix. And they circled these guys on their priority list and said, we got to get them. And that's really what happened. The visit went extremely well for them and their families, and they ended up choosing Florida while they were still on campus, really. Waller ended up committing while he was there, announcing on Monday night. And Williams on Sunday night, I guess it was, or Saturday night, whatever it was, decided to pull the trigger there. And he's not a guy who likes the spotlight. He's not somebody who does a lot of interviews. He's not somebody who is somebody who's going to set up a whole commitment ceremony and do the hats. He just wanted to get it over with. I spoke to him about it today, and he's excited to be done with the process. And I would imagine the same is for Waller. But Penn State's got some other defensive line priorities that they're going after too, and it's not a huge step down at all. And in some cases, Waller and Williams are more ends. The priority for Penn State's been interior guys too. Benedict Ume is a high priority for Penn State. He was just on campus for the official visit, and I expect him to end up at Penn State as well. The Nittany Lions are doing a great job with him. He's been on campus a couple of times now, and I think that this visit really put them over the top. I would imagine that he ends up committing to Penn State before the summer is out. And maybe before we get to July. So we'll see how things go there. And another name I would keep an eye on too is Malachi Williams too, a guy out of Philadelphia. Tons of connections to Penn State. Deion Barnes is really close with him and his family, and so I do expect him to end up at Penn State as well. He was just on an official visit to Syracuse, I believe, this weekend, and he was at Penn State, I think, last weekend. So those two guys I would definitely keep my eye on if I'm a Penn State fan.
That's what I was going to ask next, Adam, because with Penn State missing out on Jamonte Waller, and that's what is so crazy to me, because the ebbs and flows of recruiting, Penn State seems to be at least I don't want to say surefire top pick for both of these guys, but again, they walked away from campus saying, hey, we feel pretty good about it. And Florida is able to nab commitments from both of them in the same week, and Penn State unable to do that. They're not canceled. they didn't take time to think about this. They didn't step away from Florida and say, okay, let's weigh our options. Florida came in, they said, and nailed commitments from both of them, and Penn State unfortunately missing out on them. But what did the big board look like for Penn State after Jamonte Waller? I know that he was a priority. I think they pitched the Abdul Carter that he would be that next number 11, or they try to utilize him in more than just, your hand's going to be in the dirt. You're going to be an upfield defensive end. They wanted to have this diverse role for him and other parts of the conversation, but that ultimately didn't seem to be enough. So after Waller, who is that next target? Is it Williams? Is it a Jalen Harvey? Who becomes the priority after these two guys, other than the ones that you mentioned?
Yeah, Jalen Harvey is an important target for Penn State, and I would imagine he and Waller would fit a similar role. They do have similar skill sets. Harvey is a guy who, if he ends up in the SEC, plays that quote-unquote jack position, that outside linebacker rush end position that can play in space. And Waller is the same sort of prospect. He's going to do the same sort of thing at Florida. He would have done the same sort of thing at Penn State. So Harvey is a guy who's added a lot of weight since the end of the season. Really good weight too. He's bulked up, and I saw him in person a couple weeks back, and just looks like he's ready to go. He looks like he's in game shape right now, and he's somebody who Penn State fans have known about for a long time. There was buzz about a year ago that he could commit. Honestly, before the season started last year, he could have committed. Penn State is all over him. His former teammate Chop Robinson obviously is a huge part of that Penn State defense, and I would imagine that he's been in his ear to try to get him to finally pull the trigger on a commitment. But he was just out at USC this past weekend. He put out a top 5 today: USC, Penn State, Tennessee, Florida, and Maryland. So we'll keep an eye on all of that. Florida, I would imagine, would be a little bit of a long shot at this point, given the number of commitments they just had at the front 7, which is exactly where Harvey is. And Tennessee is a team who hasn't really prioritized him too much at this point. Maryland would be a team to watch, especially for the local prospect. And then you've got Penn State and USC. USC has certainly done well in the DMV, cherry picking top end talent over the last few years. So keep an eye on the Trojans for him. But those 3 guys would be ones that I'd focus in on the defensive front 7 now that Williams and Waller are off the board.
Yeah, and you mentioned Benedict Ume. Somebody that was posting alongside of him was fellow defensive lineman T.A. Cunningham. They were at least going back and forth into saying, hey, is Penn State the move? And then Benedict Ume teased it and said, big things are coming along the lines of that, and said, #we are. So Penn State fans, should they feel good about this dynamic duo kind of teaming up and coming together? What do you know about the latest on Cunningham, and if he could be alongside Ume and both commit to Penn State?
Yeah, Cunningham's recruitment has obviously been very, very interesting over the last 3 years, really. If you haven't followed his recruitment, I encourage you to look it up on Rivals.com. He was former Georgia prospect and moved out to California, and things really went sideways for him out there. He has not played a lot of football in his high school career, but he is super talented. We've seen him in a couple of camp settings, but he is blown up and physically. He looks like he's in a very different prospect, we'll say, than he was when he first burst onto the scene. He looks more like an interior defensive lineman than an edge guy like he did early on. So he's somebody to keep an eye on there. And his physical development has impacted his recruitment in a significant way. Teams aren't quite sure what type of player he will be once he arrives on campus, because he hasn't played very much, like I said. So they're just not quite sure what type of player he is at this point. So this fall is going to have a lot to do with where he ends up at the next level. And college coaches just want to see what kind of player he'll be once he ends up stepping on the field. He's going to have, at his high school, there's some significant prospects over there, and he's going to have a hard time getting consistent snaps over there, given how talented that roster is at his high school. So it's just another thing to keep an eye on too.
It is Locked On Nittany Lions, HappyValleyInsider.com. Know that website, HappyValleyInsider.com, affiliated with Penn State Rivals. So all things Penn State recruiting, everything that's as Penn State gears up for the 2023 season, you can find that at HappyValleyInsider.com. FanDuel.com. Adam, in this final segment, we're going to get a general overall picture. There are a couple prospects that Penn State is still keying in on along the defensive line, some other defensive prospects as well. I just wanted to get your thoughts on Derek Plaz, and just because of the way the commitment had happened and then he decommitted in a 48-hour, 72-hour span. So we'll finish on that note, but sticking with defensive line, Nigel Smith II, again, since Penn State is missing out on some of these other defensive target priorities, it pivots the attention back to guys that are on Penn State's radar, but it didn't seem like they were on the outside looking in, essentially, because Nigel Smith comes from Texas. It seems like Oklahoma is the biggest school that Penn State's going up against in his recruitment. But Nigel Smith, at least when he had his official visit, it seems like things were promising and that Penn State will be a player when it comes to his commitment at the end of the day.
Yeah, definitely. Penn State has done a great job with Nigel Smith throughout the recruiting process. That said, though, they have work to do. And Oklahoma being who they are and being so close to home for him, the Sooners kind of have the inside track there. And, the defensive staff over there, Brent Venables, the head coach, they've done an incredible job with those guys, throughout their careers, going back to when they were at Clemson. So Nigel Smith is somebody I'd keep an eye on more for Oklahoma at this point than Penn State. You mentioned Derek Plaz, how interesting that scenario was, committing kind of almost out of the blue, when he was on his visit, and then almost as quickly decommitting. He was at Miami this weekend. I expect him to probably end up there, although he has another visit or two set up to other schools. That could all be just kind of part of the show. I do think he'll probably end up at Miami, though, when all is said and done. A few more names that we do need to keep an eye on here for Penn State. David Pale, in-state defensive tackle. End up probably choosing Michigan or Penn State when all is said and done. That race is not over yet, so keep an eye on him. A linebacker, Chris Cole, too. He was an early official visitor for Penn State earlier this month. Georgia has made a strong impact over this weekend when he was down in Athens for his official visit. That race is not over yet, though. He wants to hold off on committing until at least August, maybe September, and that gives Penn State some time to re-engage and really, I shouldn't say re-engage, but just grab the momentum again in his recruitment. They were on him early, and I think that sticking with it could pay dividends for Penn State down the road. Liam Andrews, another lineman out of New England, out of the Boston area, could end up at Penn State as well. Wisconsin has made a big push there, but Andrews could end up on either side of the ball, defensive line or offensive line. Those are a couple other players that I would keep an eye on if I'm Penn State fans. The Nittany Lions have some work to do there still, but those guys have not crossed Penn State off their list.
I guess the last player that I have on my list personally, and who Penn State fans should as well, and that's Brian Robinson, because he took a surprise official visit. It wasn't one of those weekend-long type of affairs. It ended up being just in the middle of a week. And again, surprising because it looks like Michigan, Kentucky, some other southeast schools anyway, have his attention the most. But he does take that visit to the Nittany Lions. So again, outside looking in, does Penn State have a shot at landing Robinson?
They do. Yeah, they absolutely do have a shot at landing Robinson. Michigan, like you said, though, is kind of the team that has gotten the most headlines out of him so far. Kentucky very much in this race, too. I think those two are probably closer to the top of his list than Penn State at this point, but Robinson is somebody who Penn State could end up moving up their board as the process goes on, as other linebackers come off the board. I think he's somebody that maybe comes back to Penn State later in the process. He was also at Maryland for a quick visit. So his recruitment certainly not close to being over at this point, I don't think. And even if he does commit right now, the real recruit, a lot of people say the real recruitment starts after the first commitment. So we'll see how things turn out as we're about to get into the summer, I should say. But as the summer turns into fall, we'll see what goes on in his recruitment.
Adam, the last thing is, when should Penn State expect that next verbal commitment? Is it this week? Is it this upcoming week? Is it to start July? When should Penn State fans be celebrating as the Nittany Lions' hard work with James Franklin and company finally pays off?
Yeah, well, I believe Nick Marsh is going to be announcing at some point here soon, so you could see the fireworks start with him. Maybe Tyseer Denmark. We'll see how things go there. It'll be one of these receivers though. Marsh,
Okay.
Denmark, Brown, Gonzalez. Those guys are the ones that I would keep an eye on, and it could happen as early this week. I would imagine that it could happen before we turn to July though.
Perfect. Nittany Lion fans, I think, have been starved a little bit for that prowess when it comes to wide receiver recruiting. So I know there were talented guys, Parker Washington, Jahan Dotson. I'm not trying to slight any of the guys, but I think there's been a 3-4 year window where it seems like Ohio State has really dominated the Big Ten when it comes to wide receiver recruiting. And for Penn State to get potentially 4 verbal commits in this class is a good sign and a worthwhile hire, an upgrade with Marcus Haggins.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll see how things go for them, but you can't fault Ohio State for what they've done. I mean, it's been pretty incredible. They've got a guy coming in right now, Jeremiah Smith, who is just outstanding. Might be the best receiver to come out of Florida since Julio Jones. The comparisons are there. He's an impressive prospect, number 2 player overall. I would imagine that he sees the field at Ohio State, and his recruitment isn't over. So we'll see how things turn out for him.
And I know Penn State had an official visit lined up with him, but he's also been taking his official visits to other places, Georgia, Florida. Is he just real quickly? I don't want to take up any more of your time, Adam. Do you think he ultimately ends up at Ohio State, or is he just going through the process just because, or with the intentions that there might be something better for him out there?
I think he's just kind of going through the process to make sure he made the right choice. I do see him ending up at Ohio State. Georgia was a team to really watch for some time with him, but I think that momentum has slowed. Keep an eye on Miami, keep an eye on Florida State, keep an eye on those in-state schools, keep an eye on Penn State. Obviously, the Nittany Lions have done some things in Florida. They've gotten some big time players out of the state, but I do think he ends up at Ohio State. Brian Hartline has prioritized him early. They talk often. They're pretty close, and I think he'll end up playing in Columbus and be kind of one of those 3-and-out types that they have at the position, and go on to a pretty awesome career in the NFL. He'll be fun to watch, even if he makes a play or two against Penn State during his career. He'll be a fun guy to watch. He'll put up plenty of highlights throughout his career.
I don't want to agree with you here at this time. Hopefully he does go somewhere where he's not going to be able to hurt Penn State that much on the field, because Marvin Harrison Jr., I really can't wait for him to leave. But that's besides the point. When we get to in season, that'll be more of a discussion. But Adam, I appreciate the time. That's going to do it for another episode of Locked On Nittany Lions. Adam, of course, as always, before I let you go, where can people keep up with all the incredible work that you do outside of the show here?
Rivals.com is the place to be for all your things recruiting. PennState.rivals.com. Happy Valley Insider. You can find me on there a lot. You can find me on Twitter, Rivals Friedman on Twitter, on Instagram. You can see me there, and right here on the Locked On Nittany Lions podcast.
All right, Adam, thanks so much for the time. Can't wait to do this again very soon.
Thanks, Zach.